All right, so these are the first set of video lectures for our first kind of real substantive section on sociological research and fundamental perspectives. So in this module, what the videos are going to be covering is some of the fundamental perspectives in sociology because we don't have one cohesive worldview in this sociological discipline. The importance of research methods and what they are, and then we'll look at particular research designs in 2 or 3 videos. So there's a number of different perspectives within sociology. They have different fundamental assumptions about what society is and how we should study it. In some ways, you could see them as competing, but really what they do is they provide different ideas about what society is and how we should go about studying it, but they don't necessarily think the right way. It's um, thinking more in terms of a different way. What questions do we ask? I tend to think of this as different windows. If you think about a house and you look in the different windows, you're going to see different parts of life. You look in the living room, you see how people socialize and greet one another. You look in the kitchen, you see how they reproduce themselves through meals and through socialization. You look in the bedroom, you'll see some other kind of reproduction. um, but you really have to look in all the windows to get the full picture of what it means to live in that house and that life. And this is true in sociology as well. To explore these for a minute, it's probably worth looking at a particular issue. One issue we could look at is the maternal mortality gap. Black women in our country have died for a long time at a much higher rate in pregnancy-related issues than white women. We see these racial disparities in COVID-19 as well. Black folks and Latino folks are dying at much higher rates. Even if we pull out the issue of black folks and Latino folks getting it, we control for that, they're dying at higher rates. So these different perspectives might give us some different questions to ask about these kinds of issues. So briefly, we're going to look at structural functionalism, the critical or conflict perspectives, and symbolic interactionist perspectives. And these are all things you can read about in more depth in your book. We're going to be going over them very briefly. So for structural functionalism, the fundamental assumption is that society is kind of like a big complex body. So it's a macro perspective, meaning that it's at a very high level. You think micro, we're looking at the minutia, we're really focusing in like in a microscope. The macro is the high level. And if we think of society like a body, then we can ask, well, what's working and what isn't to keep the whole body healthy, right? To keep all of society healthy, right? And what's dysfunctioning, right? So this is known as the organismic or organic analogy. You got to be careful with that word organismic. Now, if we think about something like the maternal mortality rate, then we can ask, okay, well, what's going wrong with the healthcare system? What's dysfunctioning within the healthcare system to create this gap in mortality rates? Similarly, with COVID-19, we might ask, what's dysfunctioning in society? Where is something going wrong with the healthcare, perhaps? So this tends to look at institutions, meaning healthcare systems, education systems, and it can be very useful in that ways. But it's also been known to look at things like poverty and inequality. Famously, some people have asked, what function or purpose does inequality or poverty serve in society? And the interesting thing is when you ask that kind of question and you make some of the assumption that poverty does serve a purpose, it serves a function, then you might not be asking other questions. Right? So those assumptions, those key assumptions at the first part are very important. Right, the next perspective we're thinking about is called symbolic interactionism. Sounds pretty fancy, but basically it's getting at the idea that we all use symbols to make sense of our world. So the assumption here is that society is equal to our social interactions on a daily basis. Everything on the screen in front of you, for example, is a symbol. The words carry meaning, the image carries meaning. Right? So how do we make sense of our world? How do we make sense of what's in front of us? For example, followers of the president might believe this heavily photoshopped image is real of him saving some flood survivors from a raft. Most of us know he hardly gets outside of his golf course. But for those people, the meaning of this image is true, and it contributes to the meaning of the person they know to be that president. Right? So what we look at is if a group of people tell themselves something is true amongst themselves, then they create truth. They literally make the truth for themselves. Right? So we call this accounting for our world. Now, when we look at something like higher maternal mortality rates, they might have a bit more difficulty dealing with this, though we do know, for example, that black women are often taken less seriously. An account of a friend of mine who we might read later in this course shows how when she was, for example, experiencing extraordinary pains while pregnant, she went to her doctor's office, but they simply didn't take her seriously. They said, just go sit and wait. And it was only when she started bleeding that they began to take her seriously. And at that point, she had already gone into premature labor, and the baby died. So the way in which black women's pain is interpreted and made sense of and accounted for is very important and can be one of the things accounting for that higher mortality rate amongst black women. Alternatively, with the COVID thing, we can think about, do people take it seriously? I've heard students say they don't think African Americans take it seriously. Given the way my several sets of white downstairs neighbors behave, it's pretty clear white people don't as well. But why do certain groups maybe take this pandemic more seriously, and why do others not? Why do some wear masks and some don't? What does it mean to them? So this is a very micro perspective. We get down into the interactions every day, very nitty-gritty. Right. The last one is the conflict or critical perspective. Here we see Ida B. Wells and Karl Marx, some key founders in this line of thinking. The assumption here is that society isn't like a smoothly humming machine that needs to be fixed and repaired from time to time, or just interactions among individuals making sense of things, but it fundamentally boils down to conflicting groups who are trying to preserve resources for themselves. So what does that mean? Well, it means we ask about social forces like in whose interest, who benefits from this situation. So when we look at racial inequality and maternal death rates, we can ask certain questions about, we could ask who benefits from it, that's a rather creepy question. But we can also say that in whose interest does the healthcare system serve? And we know, just as the police system, the healthcare system tends to function more in the interest of white members of our society. Similarly, we know that the healthcare system is much more skewed in our society towards the upper class, the ruling class, who increasingly are able to secure doctors of their own who fly out on helicopters to see them if they're in the very upper class. So the idea is that there's a limited amount of healthcare, for example, and different groups are trying to preserve that for themselves and keep other people from having those things, those limited resources. The difference in this view is that social justice is usually central. There is a desire to make society better and to change it for the better. Marx famously said that, and I paraphrase, that philosophers up to now have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And that's at the fundamental of most critical and conflict perspectives. They differ whether they see race or gender or class as more central or more important, but they all tend to agree that social justice and social change are critically important. So these are the fundamental perspectives. We'll revisit these, and most of the chapters are structured around them. They can diverge, but they can also complement each other. We can see the healthcare system both dysfunctioning and also working in white people's interests, for example. And we can see that it works in white people's interest often because black women or black men's pain isn't seen as important. so we can build up each of these perspectives and complement them together. And part of what we'll be doing in our discussion is fleshing out these views, as well as, more importantly, the scientific methods we use to study society.